I'll call this story Chopsticks, because of the predicament that I found myself in. So at this point, I was feeling kind of lost, and not sure with who or what I was about to get into. I decided to sign up for a study abroad program, and even though it was kind of pricey, I wanted to live abroad, and this was the easiest way I figured I could get it done. The young man in the picture was scared, anxious, afraid, and unsure of himself, but too prideful to admit it. Even though I was the oldest student in the program, at about 27, I felt dwarfed by my peers' experiences and ability to navigate in a foreign language and culture. Although I never told them, I was impressed and didn't know how I would fit into a group like this because of my childish nature, behavior, and jokes. I was the traditional man-child and fully aware of it. I never planned on going to college, let alone live abroad. I had dreams of living in Japan when I was a teenager, but my self-doubt, anxiety, and fear of the unknown robbed me of that experience. When the picture was taken, we'd been on a 12-hour flight, I think, and all of us were tired, anxious, and ready to shower, eat, and sleep. We wanted to wash away the long flight and get situated, as best we could, in our new surroundings. I remember meeting everyone at the airport. This was after the initial program meeting in Eugene, Oregon, before we were accepted into the program. And when this picture was taken, I remember awkwardly talking to Kate, and her infectious smile was beaming through her exhaustion and worry. We carried on with small talk, and waited for our turn to get checked into whatever we were being corralled into. I remember being so overwhelmed by everything, the people, the language, the culture, everything. I'd never been outside the US in a meaningful way, except Mexico when I was about 22, but that was not as life-changing or even shocking. Looking back, the simplicity of my thinking at the time was infantile and closed-minded, even though I always considered myself very open and aware of other people's cultures. After we were all checked in, the director of the program, Pat Lucas, was there to greet us and let us in on some ideas about our upcoming experience. You see, he had been living in China for about 15 years at the time and was knowledgeable about the language and culture. Although, as we would learn a bit later, his ideas were a bit jaded. He had us load onto a bus and told us that the school we'd be checking into was called Minzu Daxue, or CUN, the Central University for Nationalities. We loaded onto the bus, picking seats and distracting ourselves in the process. Before too long, the bus was creaking with sounds of the air brakes being let loose and rolling out of the airport and onto the freeway. We were all looking out the windows as the bus rushed down the freeway on our hour-long ride to our destination. It was dusk and night was setting in with new smells, sounds, and a plethora of new experiences that were flooding our senses. We pulled up to a gate that had Chinese characters written on the wall. That, at the time, was like a splash of cold water to the face, because I had no idea what they meant. I had studied the Chinese language in a set of condensed summer classes that hurried by me at a breakneck pace. I couldn't understand the lessons, the words, or speech that was being bombarded at me and left me reeling. I took the classes because the program, which I was currently standing, had a requirement of 1 year of Chinese classes. So I took 1 year of classes, not bothering to study or learn the language, thinking that I would learn later. Boy, did I. After we stood there for a few minutes, Pat told us to go upstairs, place our luggage in our rooms, and take a 15-minute break, then meet him downstairs. He was going to take us to a traditional Chinese dinner. After the short intermission, I went downstairs and met up with the rest of the strangers that I would call lifelong friends, and people to whom I love dearly. We endured patch jokes and small talk. Then we walked together down the poorly maintained streets of Beijing, trying not to trip over the brick pavers that were violently clamoring to come apart. The endless trip hazards, noxious smells, foreign sounds, and unfamiliar atmosphere was closing in on all of us. We walked maybe 5 to 10 minutes before we were standing in front of a building that resembled a restaurant, but had a somewhat traditional, New Age style on the outside. Pat informed us we are here, and that he was going to let them know we had arrived. and inquired about the status of the room he had reserved for the group. You see, in China, for large groups you reserve a room, so that the group can have their fun without disturbing the other patrons if the spirits become too strong. In the US, this habit would generally be reserved for the elite or wealthy that want to be separated from the riffraff or rabble that could surround them. But here in China, it was simple and customary for large groups to do this, a way to separate themselves from the hustle and bustle of the ever-encroaching city that seethed and surged with lights and sounds that never seemed to stop. As we sat down, trying to understand our surroundings, assessing where we were going to be sitting, which is a challenging prospect because we were tired, confused, and bewildered, as most of us didn't really know each other, and some, like myself, had never left the country in a meaningful way. I was unfamiliar with these foods. The menu was in Chinese characters. Everyone spoke the language, which is obvious and to be expected, but still a shock to experience. It's an odd deal to be a duck out of water, so to speak. Someone that is a bit lost and bewildered. It seems like you're living in an alternate dimension that stands in stark comparison to the normal world you're accustomed to. Everything is the same, but different. The sounds, the smells, the looks. As a foreigner, the world is different in such large and small ways, with subtle hints scattered between. It changes the way you see yourself and others, your sense of self as an individual and the culture you come from as a whole. As Pat once put it, the foil or mirror to which you look at yourself and your culture as a way to contrast and compare. The saying, "You don't know what you don't know," became clear to me at that moment. I was a foreigner in a foreign land and had no knowledge of how to navigate this world. As the menu was being presented and the hieroglyphs were fresh, the sense of bewilderment was coming to the forefront of my mind. The overwhelming options staring back at me through the cryptic symbols was stifling. This was not my biggest obstacle that would be presented that night. Pat ordered the dishes in what I would later figure out was a scripted cadence. As I talked about before, I had a very aloof nature. That led me to many instances of procrastination. And this is where I found my mind going to when I looked down onto the table and realized there were no Western utensils, also known as a fork, spoon, or knife. This was already apparent to what seemed like everyone else seated at the table. And this was my true introduction to everyone else. But to everyone's surprise, as I saw in their faces and heard in their words, I hadn't thought about learning how to use chopsticks. As my eyes searched for a way to overcome this deficiency, many of my new friends noticed my puzzled expression as my eyes were darting around the table and asked me, "Do you not know how to use chopsticks?" And, "Didn't you think you should learn how to use them before you came?" To which I shrugged, trying to play it cool, while I was soaked in embarrassment. The food was arranged on small to medium-sized plates, spread across the table, meant to be shared family style, as it is known in the United States. Small plates were placed in front of us, with bowls of rice next to them. These were meant to be used for bite-sized portions of the dishes that were on the table. You may be wondering the same thing as me. How can I get this food onto these plates without a fork? I grasped the disposable chopsticks on the table, pulled them out of their paper sheath, and broke them in two, mimicking what everyone else was doing. Grasping onto the two sticks was like picking up an instrument I'd never used. I had no idea how to hold them, move them, or understand them. I paused and thought to myself, why not just use them as sticks, like little shovels? I was so engrossed in my thoughts I lost track of where I was and anyone in the vicinity. So I started pushing the food in my mouth, like an enfeebled person that no longer had fine control of their fingers. I was realizing how hungry I really was as I was eating. My body enjoyed it. And at that moment I snapped out of my daze and looked up to see the surprised faces of everyone around me, smiling in amazement that I was eating in such a way. I smiled and said, "I'll figure out how to use these things, but for now, I'll do what I need to eat." I paused and thought to myself, why not just use them as... We endured patch jokes and small talk. Then we talked. See, in China, for large groups, you reserve a room so that the group can have their fun without distracting the other patrons. It was simple and customary for large groups to do these. A way to separate, trying to understand our surroundings, assessing where we were going to be sitting, which is a challenging prospect because we were tired, confused, and bewildered, as most of us didn't really know each other, not in a meaningful way. And some, like myself, had never left the country in a meaningful way. It's an odd deal. As the menu was being presented and the hieroglyphs were fresh in my mind, the sense of bewilderment. So I took 1 year of classes, not bothering to study or understand the language, thinking that I would learn later. Boy, did I. As the menu was being presented and the hieroglyphs were fresh in my mind, the sense of bewilderment was coming to the forefront of my mind. The overwhelming options staring back at me. As the menu was being presented and the hieroglyphs were fresh, the sense of bewilderment was coming to the forefront of my mind. The overwhelming options staring back at me through the cryptic symbols was... As we sat around the table, taking in the nuances of a new world with unknown expectations, to which I figured out shortly after the food arrived. As I talked, as we sat down, the food was arranged on small to medium-sized plates spread across the table, meant to be shared, family style, as is known. As we all sat around the table, taking in the nuances of a new world with unknown expectations, although some of which I figured out shortly after the food arrived. As I talked about before, I had a very aloof nature that led me to many instances of procrastination. And this is where I found my mind going to when I looked down onto the table and realized there were no Western utensils, also known as a fork, spoon, and knife. It was already apparent to what seemed like everyone else at the table. This was my true introduction